Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. We are going to be now talking about the cosmological argument for God's existence. So let's get started. So the core argument assumes a fundamental distinction between two kinds of entities or beings that exist. We can call one kind dependent beings, and these are beings on whose existence is caused or explained by other things. So, what are some of these things that are dependent beings? Well, maybe we can think about this. What about this pen? Is this pen a dependent being? Well, if we want to ask, if we want an answer to that question, then we just simply ask, was this caused? Does this exist because it was caused by something else? And the question is yes, it was caused by all sorts of materials in a factory. What about a chair? Similarly, a chair was also caused by various materials being put together in a particular way in the somewhat not distant past, but yeah, recent past. What about humans? What about you? Are you a dependent being? Yes, you were caused by the coming together of your parents, right? More generally, another way of thinking about dependent beings, which I think it's useful, is because you were caused, or things that are dependent were caused to be. Another way of thinking about a dependent being is that they are contingent beings. That is, they didn't have to exist. So, for example, I didn't have to exist. It's possible that I could have failed to exist, right? Maybe there's a world in which my parents don't meet or end up with different partners, or even if you want to get really um, very metaphysical about what makes me me and presume that it's my particular genes, then even just the fact that that a particular sperm and egg came together to give rise to my genes is also contingent, right? It could have been different. Chairs, again, most objects that we come across are contingent beings. And so the really here the question is, okay, well, everything is contingent, or most things are contingent, right? So what is the distinction that we're trying to draw between two kinds of things? Well, the other kind of thing that exists is what we can call a self-existing being or entity. One whose existence is explained by its own nature. That is, it's in its nature that makes it the kind of thing that exists and not some other thing, right? So notice that all of us are ultimately explained, or dependent beings are ultimately explained by reference to another kind of entity, right? We cannot account for our existence if we don't mention another kind of entity. There are parents, or so on and so forth, or a particular physical process. So, what is an self-existent being? Well, again, insofar as this is an argument for God's existence, obviously looking to the argument and projecting where the argument is leading, obviously God is going to be one of these self-existent beings, right? But in my opinion, I think this argument would be somewhat weakened if God is the only kind of being that is self-existing. In my opinion, this argument is more independently motivated if there are other kinds of things that are also self-existing. That way, the distinction does not seem question-begging. Because there's a sense in which you can argue, okay, so there are dependent beings whose existence is caused by something else, and then there's God whose own existence is caused by himself. And almost by definition, you get to God existing because, again, his existence is necessitated by his very own nature. And so, insofar as the dialectic is that this is an argument that is supposed to persuade individuals of believing in God, that type of argumentational strategy seems somewhat suspect. So I think it's important that there are other kinds of self-existing beings, and I think there are. So what are some things whose own nature is explained, or whose existence is explained by its own nature? Well, most plausibly, numbers. numerical objects. And I think we kind of have thought about this, or this example has come up in previous lectures. So the number 3 seems to be the kind of thing whose existence does not depend on any other object. Like, what object does the number 3 depend on? What caused the number 3, right? Recall our definition of an existence whose caused or explained. There's no further number that caused, or thing that has caused 3 to be, right? And in fact, it seems, now someone might say here, and this is where it gets kind of tricky, someone might say, oh, maybe, what about God? Didn't God create numbers? Maybe. But here's one reason why you think that maybe that's not the case. And this works better with the Christian God, but it can also work with, I think, with all other conceptions of God. According to the Christian God, God is one person and one God in essence, but 3 persons, according to the Christian tradition, right? And so the question is, has God always been a Trinity? And the answer is yes, he's always been a Trinity. Well, that means that number 3 has always existed, because God is 3 persons, right? So that's a way in which you can kind of see how it's not so obvious what it would mean for God to create the number 3, since he's always been 3 persons, right? That's why a lot of philosophers and Christian philosophers have always kind of said that numbers exist, coexist in a way with God, and maybe in his mind, but they are not created. All right. So there we have a distinction then. So we have numbers whose existence is not explained by some other object, but by their own nature. With this distinction in mind, we can formulate the core argument, the cosmological argument. And it goes like this. Premise 1 is every being that exists or ever did exist is either a dependent being or a self-existing being. In other words, this just says that there's only these 2 modes of existence. Okay, fair enough. Premise 2, not every being can be a dependent being. Okay. Therefore, there exists a self-existing being. Now, this is the way that Rowe formulates the argument in his article, right? But even our previous discussion may lead us to really realize that this argument clearly has some hidden premises, right? Because if all we are led to infer is that there exists a self-existing being, then this argument wouldn't really suggest God's existence, because as I have just said, numbers seem to be self-existing beings, right? And insofar as that's true, then number 1 is true. So 1 can grant number 1, and what can grant number 2? Not every being can be a dependent being. Yeah, because there are numbers. Therefore, there exists a self-existing being. Therefore, their numbers exist. So clearly, this argument has a hidden premise, namely that not every being can be a dependent being, because their own existence must be explained by a particular kind of self-existing being. And therefore, that self-existing being exists, right? So that is the hidden premise. And in that case, numbers cannot fulfill that role, right? Because numbers don't cause anything else. Like the number 3 does not cause anything in the world. Numbers or mathematical objects are what we call abstract objects. And abstract objects are not spatio-temporal. They don't live in the space and time, right? Like the number 5 is not under my table or under yours or anywhere in space-time, right? And that's the reason, because numbers are not in space and time, they cannot have causal properties, and therefore they cannot cause things. All right. So this is the argument, but again, the rationale behind it is that there is an existing being who must be responsible for explaining the existence of dependent things. The first premise, so here's, let's start with the first premise then. depends on the principle of sufficient reason, or what we can call PSR. And this principle really has two parts. The first part just says that there must be an explanation for the existing of any being, right? And so that's why either things are dependent beings because their nature must be explained by something, or they're explained by their own nature. But in either case, there must be an explanation for people for beings' existence, for things' existence. That's what the first part of the PSR principle says. The second part is similar, but there just says that there must be an explanation of any positive fact, and this will become important in a second, in a few minutes when we discuss a popular objection by Hume to this kind of argument. Essentially, this says that well, let me first talk about positive fact. So positive fact is a fact that says that something is the case. So for example, there's milk in my fridge. That's a positive fact, right? A negative fact is something like there's no milk in my fridge, right? Or there are no eggs in my fridge. That would be a negative fact. And this PSR says that that we must have an explanation for positive facts, not negative facts. And the reason is because there are too many, and we don't really know the kinds of things that would explain certain kinds of negative. For example, why don't I have boar in my fridge? Or why don't I have, there's so many random things. Why don't I own a Tesla? Right? There's so many facts that don't need an explanation. What we do need an explanation is about positive facts. So I own a Honda. Something needs to explain that, right? And whether I purchased it, where I purchased it from, what is a Honda, right? And so how was this Honda car created? That has an explanation, and it must have an explanation. But not so with negative facts. And so the main idea here is that PSR, or the principle of sufficient reason, rules out brute facts. That is, things that just exist with no reason. All right. The second premise, then, is that not every being can be dependent. And why would we say that? What can support this claim? Well, suppose that there were an infinite number of dependent beings whose existence is explained by each other, right? So A is caused by A2. So suppose that these are different objects or events. A is caused by A2, A2 by A3, and so on infinitely, right? So in this case, this would be the denial of this premise, right? This would say that, oh, look, you can have one being depending on other dependent beings indefinitely. But the problem here is that even if we had this picture of one event caused by another, so you are explained by your parents are explained by their parents, and it goes back and back and back through ancestry, and if you believe in evolution, through all the different species, and then you get to the biochemistry, and then you get to the Big Bang, which we'll discuss in a second, and maybe, well, I guess right now we're supposing that the Big Bang is not an actual event, because we're assuming that the past is infinite in this case, and it doesn't have a precise starting point. So forget the Big Bang for a second. Just imagine that it just keeps going back and back and back and back through different iterations of Earth and or universe or energy, or however it is that you think the past it should be described. And it just goes indefinitely. So for every dependent being, there's another dependent being which explains its existence. Why can't we have that picture? Well, sure, even if you assume that that's the case, it still would not explain why they are dependent beings at all. Why is there something rather than nothing? Especially given that, again, we are contingent beings. We didn't have to exist, right? We didn't have to exist. All the universe did not have to exist. Everything in the universe did not have to exist. So why does it exist? Right? There's a positive fact here that seems to be missing, right? All right, so here's the collection fallacy and or the composition fallacy, which Hume famously made against this type of argument, and he said, look, you're saying that A caused 1, sorry, A was caused by 2, 2 by 3, and so on, right? But now you're demanding, or it's explained, right? But now you're demanding that now the whole series needs to be explained, right? Like, Hume is telling you, Hume is arguing criticizing this argument, saying, look, I gave you a way in which you can have only dependent beings, and they're explained by other dependent beings, namely this infinite series of one dependent being explaining the other one. But now you're demanding that I explain the whole series, as if the whole series needed an explanation. And he says that's a collection and or composition fallacy. And why is it a fallacy? Because just because a member of a collection or of a composition has a particular feature doesn't mean that the whole thing has that same feature. So for example, all humans have a mother and a father probably, right? But it doesn't follow that humanity as a collection has a father or a mother, right? Similarly, all the objects in this series can be explained by other objects, and they require an explanation. It doesn't follow that the whole series likewise requires an explanation. And so it's a fallacy, according to Hume. The way to respond to this fallacy, as Rose correctly suggests, is just to deny that that's the way that we are thinking. We don't think that the series needs an explanation because the members of which it is a part need an explanation. We're not arguing in that, we're not trying to draw that inference, which is fallacious. Instead, we're arguing that the series, the fact that there's a series of dependent beings, that is a positive fact. And remember, according to the principle of sufficient reason, positive facts need to be explained. There must be an explanation for every single fact, including the fact that that the reality really just consists in a series of events that stretch back indefinitely into the past. That requires an explanation. Okay, so that's the way that this argument is addressed. So a lot of this really comes down to the principle of sufficient reason, right? Again, this is the reason. This is the principle, which has two parts: that there must be an explanation of the existence of any being, or that there must be an explanation of any positive fact. And so the question is, why should we believe this? Well, so why can there be brute facts, as it were, things that have no explanation? That's ultimately what it comes down to. And honestly, it's hard to adjudicate. I think it comes down to intuition. Like, do you find it intuitive that everything that exists must have an explanation for its existence? Right? Or can there just be brute facts, things that just exist for absolutely no reason, even if they didn't have to exist? Right? So it really comes down to intuition or your rationality. Do you believe that that's the case? So the intuitive defense, I think, is one of the primary defenses, which is like, this principle just seems intuitive to many people, and it seems to be a rational intuition, right? Like, surely there must be an explanation, right? All right. Let's talk about another alternative. So far, although we should linger here for a second, although we'll come back to the no, actually, no. My apologies. Let's stick with the order in which I have laid this out. Big Bang Theory. So what is Big Bang Theory? Well, according to Big Bang Theory, the universe began about 13.8 billion years ago from an extremely hot, dense state. Essentially, the whole universe was squashed together into this state. But it's more than that, right? There's a sense in which from Big Bang Theory, we get this idea that space and time themselves begin with the Big Bang. That is, there's no before in the usual sense. So it's hard. Try to think about nothing. So according to Big Bang, there was nothing. And by nothing, so if you're imagining nothing, right now imagine nothing. So just take a second and imagine nothing. Well, what you're probably imagining is empty space, right? But here's the thing. That actually is something. That's space. according to Big Bang Theory, there's no space because space itself comes into being at the Big Bang. Another way of thinking about it is, according to physics, really space and time and energy and matter are really all different ways of describing the same phenomenon, quite frankly. So space, time, matter, energy, all of that comes into existence at the Big Bang roughly 13.8 billion years ago. Prior to that, there is nothing. Right? And so this is one way in which you can, I don't want to say explain, but if this is one option that people have, right? Let's talk about this in terms of options. So what can you believe? Well, on one hand, you can obviously believe that God is the reason and the explanation behind the universe, which is the creator, the cosmological creator, the cause, which is what ultimately the cosmological argument wants to say, that you should believe in God because you need an explanation for the existence of everything. That's one option. The other option is that, well, there's no explanation and really everything came out of nothing. Right? As the Big Bang suggests. Actually, I forgot to say that part of the reason how we know that the Big Bang occurred is because we can trace, I mean, there's a lot of reasons that support the Big Bang Theory. It's a really well-supported theory. It's really hard to deny, quite frankly. Almost every physicist or cosmologist believes in the Big Bang Theory. And one of the main reasons that we believe in is because we can see that the universe is expanding. And maybe you've learned this in your physics class or cosmology class. The universe is expanding, and we can actually track the rate at which it is expanding. This is constant, and the rate at which it is expanding is called Hubble's constant. And we can see by measuring how far the stars are and have been, how fast it's expanding, and it's increasingly expanding, which is kind of interesting. It's accelerating. Like the more it expands, it's expanding faster, the universe. And we can use that to track back to the origin, right? So we just do reverse engineering to know that it all started at a particular rate because we have the rate of expansion plus the size, and we can know that it all started 13.8 billion years ago, and there's other evidence as well for this dating. And so you could believe that everything, the world, just came out of nothing. Okay, and this is another way of thinking about the brute fact. It's a brute fact, but it's a particular kind of brute fact, right? It's not merely that things exist and that they are not explained, but it's saying that out of nothing, and again, by nothing we literally mean like no space and no time. There's no space and no time, and boom, everything came into being. Okay, so that's one option, which is pretty hard to believe, if you ask me, that out of nothing, literally nothing, everything came into existence. Nevertheless, it's an option you can believe. And it's one that I'm sure many physicists believe. Then you have the option of God, but you do also have this other option about an infinity of events, right? Which we kind of have alluded to, and we kind of assumed, okay, yeah, suppose that there's an infinity of events in the past, right? But that's, if you really think about it, that is a very hard thing to actually imagine how that's possible, right? Because what are we saying? We're saying that an infinite number of past events have occurred. Not a large number of events, an infinite number of events. So let's try to grasp this. This means that if you go back in the past, trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of years, there's still an infinite past left in the past. Why? Because that's the nature of infinity. And it's hard to understand how an infinite set of past events have already occurred, right? Sometimes one may get confused when thinking about this, because you might think, oh, I can conceive of infinity, but an existing in infinity, but most of the time when we think about that, we're thinking about a potential infinity, not an actual infinity. So Sure, many of us, especially if you believe in an afterlife, you can be like, yeah, I can imagine myself and living forever. But what you're really imagining in is a potential infinity, one in which you just keep living and there's no end in sight. But it's a potential. Like, you never actually live out the infinity. It's potential. It's always in potential. It's always future oriented, right? So that seems completely fine and conceptually possible for you to believe in a potential future infinity. But that's not the infinite past. The infinite past is a fixed set of events, an infinite set of events that have already occurred. An infinite set of events have already happened. And that's where it becomes very difficult to understand how that's even possible, right? Now, you might think, wait a second, that seems absurd, right? That an infinite past exists, but somebody might correctly suggest, but isn't the option of believing in a God also kind of committed to that? Because hasn't God been around forever in the past? And so if it's absurd to think about an infinite past, isn't it also absurd to think about God who has existed in an infinite past? That would be absurd, except that for most philosophers and theologians, God is defined as non-spatial temporal. God exists outside of time and space. The problem of the infinity arises once you bound it up into space-time. And we'll talk a little in a second about a particular way in which we can think about this. But because it's outside of God is outside of the space-time continuum. In fact, if you believe in God, then God created a space-time continuum. Then there is no past for God. There's no present. There's no future. That's another reason how you can kind of explain how God knows the future. God doesn't live in the present like we do. God lives outside of time, according to philosophers and theologians. So let's take stock. So we have three options, right? So far, either everything comes out of nothing, or everything exists eternity past, and or there exists a God, right? Okay, I want to do one more argument here with respect to an infinite past, whether it's actually possible. And this is an argument from a philosopher called William Lane Craig. And it's based on a mathematical thought experiment called Hilbert's Hotel about the nature of infinity. So I'll play this really short video. When I was testing this, you can hear it. The video was recording with audio, so I hope that's still the case. It's only a minute long, so even if it's completely, and you can't hear it, unfortunately, hopefully it's not going to ruin the video. But again, when I tested it, you were able to hear it. And just to kind of help you see where this is going, the basic premise here is that once you allow an infinite number of events to actually exist in space-time, that leads to all sorts of paradoxes. It's really contradictions. And so because we cannot have contradictions in reality, then that's why an infinite set of past events cannot actually exist, is the idea. All right, so go ahead and play this. Again, it's only 1 minute long, and I think it's just useful so that you're able to like see it. Oh no, what's going on here? Okay, this might not work actually. I might have to explain this. Okay, I'm gonna have to pause the video here and then I'll record after.
Imagine you a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, and each of these rooms has a guest staying in it. But then one more shows up asking for a room. Now you might think there's no space, but your hotel has infinite rooms. So you just have to ask the guest in room 1 to move to room 2. Then room 2 moves to room 3, repeating all the way to infinity. Now you have an available room for the new guest. But what happens when a bus pulls up and it has an infinite amount of passengers? you would need more than just one empty room. So to make sure you have enough space, you ask every guest already in the hotel to double their room number. The people in room 1 go to room 2, and room 2 goes to room 4, room 3 to room 6, all the way to infinity. Now all the odd number rooms are empty, 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on. And since there are infinite odd numbers, you can fit every person from the bus. And this is possible because infinity isn't just big, it bends logic, making space where none should exist.
Oh. All right, so hopefully you were able to hear that explanation of Hilbert's Hotel and why an actual infinity is not... It seems to, like, an actual number of infinite events allows for contradictions, right? So in Hilbert's Hotel, which it was named after Hilbert, who is a famous mathematician, you own this hotel and it's infinite. It has an infinite number of rooms, right? As you saw from the video. And suppose that it's full. So the hotel is full. And suppose that you, being the owner of this hotel, are just sitting in the lobby and you have a brand new customer come in and wants to check in. Now, in one sense, the hotel is full. But in another sense, it's not, right? Because the thing about infinity is that you can have bigger infinities than other infinities. So what do? You ask each customer in your hotel or each client to move from their room to the one next door. So you have all the infinite set of customers just move to number 2, 2 to number 3, the one in room number 4 to number 5, and now room number 1 is vacant. And so now you are allowed the new customer your new client to stay in your hotel. And that seems contradictory, right? Because at once we're saying that the hotel is full and the hotel is not full, and you can allow one customer. And of course, you can get even more ridiculous, as the example suggests. Suppose, again, that your hotel is infinite. Again, sorry, it is infinite, but your infinite hotel is full. But now you have a bus that comes in with an infinite number of people. Can you accommodate them into your hotel that is full? Can your hotel, which is full, accommodate an infinite number of new clients? And the answer is yes, again, because of the nature of infinity. So what do? You ask each customer that's presently in your hotel to multiply the number in which you're staying times 2 and move to that room. So for example, if number 1, whoever's staying in room number 1, multiply that number times 2 equals 2. And now they have to go to room number 2. Whoever's in room number 2 will multiply that number times 2, which equals 4. So that person now moves to room number 4. Now what happens when you multiply every number that's multiplied by 2, it's an even number. So that means that you end up, and how many even numbers are there? Well, an infinite amount. That's why you're able to fit your existing clientele in the even numbered rooms, because there's an infinite number of infinite number of even numbers. Okay, and once you've done that, all of the odd number rooms are now empty. So, and how many odd numbers are there? An infinite amount. So you have an infinite amount of empty rooms now, which you can then fill up with the infinite customers that just arrived. So again, it's full. Your hotel is full, but you can also allow an infinite number of people. So according to Will and Craig, this is an argument against an infinite past. And the argument goes like this. Premise number 1, if an actual infinite could exist in reality, then absurd situations like Hilbert's hotels could also exist in reality. Hilbert's hotel, if real, would produce contradictions. For example, a fully occupied hotel would still accommodate infinitely many new guests. But contradictory, absurd situations cannot exist in reality, especially contradictions, right? You cannot have, for example, it cannot be true that I'm holding a pen in my hand and that I'm not holding a pen in my hand at the same time. That's a contradiction. Contradictions cannot abide in reality. Therefore, an actual infinite cannot exist in reality. So this is another reason why an infinite past seems really hard to obtain. So again, one way of thinking about this lecture, the way that I like to think about it, is that it seems like all of the options that you have to believe about the nature of reality are actually extraordinary. Because you might think, and and this is not like a silly thought. It seems initially plausible, right? You might think, oh, somebody who believes in God believes in something extraordinary, like just incredible. And that is an extraordinary belief. Like to believe in a mind that is out there, that created everything and that sees everything and is omnipotent is an incredible belief. But you might be inclined, somebody might be inclined to be like, oh yeah, so this is the distinction. Theist, or people who believe in God, believe in extraordinary things, but I choose not to believe in God. And so I just don't believe in extraordinary things. Like, right? So the distinction can often be drawn between people that believe extraordinary things and people who don't believe extraordinary things. But that, I believe, is mistaken. It seems that everybody must believe in something incredibly extraordinary, right? Because think about the options that you have. You have to believe one of these. There are no other options. You either have to believe in an actual infinite past. And again, we just saw from Hilbert's Hotel that it seems to be contradictory. But even if you think the argument doesn't work, maybe you think that mathematical properties seem suspect in general to apply to the real world. Again, think about what that looks like, an actual infinite past, where after trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of years going backwards in time, there's still an infinity left, and that it actually has passed already. That option seems incredible or extraordinary. The second option is, again, that everything at the Big Bang, that there is no infinite past, but that everything came out of nothing. And by nothing, again, we mean no space and no time. That space and time came out of no space and no time. Again, extremely mind-boggling how that can be the case. And the third option is also incredible, that there is this intelligent being who created, the university. Yes, the university. But also the world, right? So either way, it seems like all options are extraordinary. And hopefully this has kind of, helped you decide what it is that you want to believe. All right, in the next lecture, we will talk about an even more extraordinary argument, namely the ontological argument. Thank you for listening.